No, I was surprised. I knew we had had a lot of problems under Roosevelt, and the Great Depression, after all, lasted a whole decade. It was 20% unemployment in the United States, only 11% in the rest of the world. I didn't really understand why until I began to study Roosevelt's policies.
Did you, you know, I have up here on the board that people loved Roosevelt. Tell me who Henry Morgenthau was.
Henry Morgenthau was Roosevelt's Secretary of Treasury.
Okay.
The two men were great friends.
And they had, it wasn't, Morgenthau was really kind of one of the architects of the New Deal.
He was.
Okay.
He'd been a friend of Roosevelt's for 20 years. They did a lot of socializing together, and they had lunch and dinner together, and they were great friends, and cabinet meetings were important to both of them.
Okay. Now, take Burton off the screen for a second, and I want to show you a quote from Morgenthau if we have it. This is what Morgenthau said in, I think it was 1939. Do you have it up here for the screen? He said, "We are spending more money than we have ever spent before, and it does not work." This is the Secretary of the Treasury in 1939. It does not work. "I want to see this country prosperous. I want to see people get a job. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have had just as much unemployment as when we started, and enormous debt to boot." Can you imagine the Treasury Secretary saying that? And he's one of the designers. He's one of the designers.
He's one of the architects.
So, Burton, how and why is that just erased from history?
Well, I had to pull it out of the archives in the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York. But it's an important quotation, and it shows that even the New Dealers themselves, Glenn, recognized after 2 terms of all of this spending, doubling the national debt, it had not worked, and unemployment was still higher than almost anywhere else in the world.
Okay, so now, Burton, give me the 1920s, the untold story of the 1920s. Give me some of the facts. We just talked about roughly
Sure.
the Depression of the 1920s that no one knows. Give them to me.
Well, the 1920s, they're that decade in between Woodrow Wilson on one hand and Franklin Roosevelt on the other. And it was a decade where the progressives were not in power. Wilson was out. Roosevelt, Franklin was not yet in. And so what we have are Harding and Coolidge in the presidency. And what we see is that depression starting in 1920, 1921. We have unemployment at 12%. We have a lot of people arguing what we need is a stimulus package, government programs to build roads so that cars can drive on, that sort of thing, with government expense. Harding and Coolidge say, no. We're going to trust our entrepreneurs to do the job. We're not going to try to micromanage the economy. They end up cutting the tax rate from 73% eventually to 25% at the top levels. And what we begin to see is a tremendous outpouring of entrepreneurship. We get, radios are invented and expanded. We get air conditioning developed in the 1920s, and the implications of that for the American South are tremendous. We get talking movies invented in the 1920s. Even the zipper and Scotch tape are all inventions of the 1920s. We cut taxes, we turned entrepreneurs loose, and that decade was tremendously prosperous. We ended that depression. We went from 12% unemployment in 1921 to 2% unemployment in 1923.
Burton, would you say that, I was thinking this the other day, that, Ronald Reagan said that if freedom fails here, where will the rest of the world run? And I was thinking about that phrase the other day, and I thought, we are the place that John Galt ran to in Atlas Shrugged. That's America. But it required everybody there to not look for a handout. And what the progressives try to do is make sure there are no peaks and valleys, that there is no good times and then a crash and a good time. That's not possible to create. There'll be crashes. And there were crash after crash after crash. But they were short-lived crashes. We didn't go through long periods. They were just short-lived. But those highs, that nobody concentrates. Everybody tries to concentrate on the Roaring '20s as being an age of greed, but it really wasn't for the average person. The average person the life changed for most Americans in the 1920s, probably more dramatically than maybe any other time period up to then?
I think you may be right, Glenn. We had a doubling or more than a doubling in college enrollments. We had a higher rate of literacy in the 1920s than we have today in American society. You get in the 1920s, Glenn, unemployment drops. In the Coolidge years, the unemployment is 3.3% average, inflation 1%. That's the lowest misery index of any president in the 20th century.
Real quick, I have to take a break. I just want to finish up this segment here with Roosevelt. Roosevelt, am I wrong by saying there was a good portion of people that thought, holy cow, I'm glad he's dead? He was turning into a dictator.
Well, there were a lot of people who thought that, and as you pointed out, we immediately had a constitutional amendment to prevent any other president serving longer than 2 terms. Part of Roosevelt's success.
Tell me, just so people don't, because constitutional amendment, it doesn't happen anymore. Explain that that's not a one-party thing. You can't get a constitutional amendment through with one party.
No, you had more than one party involved in this. Some of the Democrats went along with it as well. Many of the Southern Democrats were upset with Roosevelt, and the Republicans as well, and we just decided that 2-term limit was the best idea, that it had not worked well with 4 terms of Franklin Roosevelt.
Burton, thank you very much, and I want to leave it there on Roosevelt, and now I want to go to George Washington and Sacred Fire, because 2 terms, there was a reason it was 2 terms. A reason. I'll explain in just a second. All right, we're back with Peter Lilback and Jerry Falwell Jr. from Liberty University. And Jerry, I don't mean to make you sit here quietly for a second, but I want to talk to you in the next break because you're a chancellor at a university. And you are trying to set things straight in your university, and I want to talk to you in a minute about how difficult it is in that position, and finding professors that won't buy into the revisionist history. This is just such a tremendous book, and I want to talk to you a little bit about, because what you do in this book is you say, okay, here's the theory that you read about in the history books, and they say this. And then you just, it's an avalanche of information. I mean, it's startling. There's so much proof that they're wrong, and it's all footnoted. When you were writing this about George Washington, when you first saw this stuff, did you have any idea on how wrong they have gotten George Washington?
The only way I knew Washington was through his writers, through his historians. And everyone said he was a deist. He mocked the scriptures. He only used it for humor, if he ever did.
And hang on just a second. In case you don't know what a deist is, because they're not real popular. And they weren't back then either, no. Right? A deist is somebody who believes in God as a watchmaker, that he started things rolling and then, okay, have a good time, guys. I'm going to go over here and play pool. And so it's just a machine that's running now. He doesn't believe in Jesus or anything else, right? Okay.
So if you're a deist, why bother to pray? Why do you need a clergyman? Why do you need religion? Because God had started, he's gone. I was convinced, because I had read scholars, that was the case, and my heart was really kind of despairing. And I started reading the quotes that those very authors had, and I said, wait a second. That text they're using to support Washington as unbeliever that he wrote has a Bible verse in it. But apparently the scholars who were reading didn't know what the Bible was. Well, if you don't read the Bible, how are you going to recognize a Bible verse?
It's like the Declaration of Independence. It's riddled with Bible verses.
That's right.
It's riddled with them.
So I started going through, and lo and behold, in the very books that were advertising the unbelief of Washington in his texts, there they were, filled with reference. I said, these guys don't see what they're seeing. They can't be right. And so I was astounded by the time, 15 years later, working on it, just how much material there is to show that he had a vibrant, personal Anglican or Episcopalian Christian faith.
So you believe that this was an error of history, that they just didn't know, or this was a purposeful change in him?
I think there's an element of both. We can really see a shift that occurred at the bicentennial celebration of Washington's birth. That's in the early 1900s, 1930.
Wait a minute, the progressive era?
The progressive era.
Who would have guessed that? That's weird, okay.
In other words, a devout, evangelical, Christian founding father didn't play well for those that wanted to move beyond Christian influence in government,
right,
Western civilization. So they needed a more secular Washington, and scholars found a way to present him in that form.